Peppa Pig, the box. It happened on a grey day. Rain drizzled over the garden and the grass glistened with drops. Peppa and George were playing near a tree when they saw it. A box, old, dusty, unmarked. It stood directly on the ground as if it had just appeared. "Look, George!" Peppa exclaimed. "What's that?" They approached it carefully. The box was light, almost empty. Peppa picked it up and something inside rustled faintly. They brought it home and placed it in the corner of the room next to their toys. When Mummy saw the box, she frowned. "Where did you find that?" "It came by itself," Peppa answered. Mummy looked at the box for another moment, then turned away without saying anything. The next morning the box had changed. Inside was a small toy car, red, shiny, brand new, like it had just come from a store. George picked it up and quickly pulled his hoof away. The car was ice cold, as if it had been buried in snow. They decided to keep it, just a toy, probably. On the second day there was a doll inside the box, tiny, wearing a grey dress. Its bead-like eyes pointed in different directions. When Peppa picked it up, the doll shivered slightly, as if something had sighed inside it. Peppa quickly placed it on the shelf. The doll stood there, motionless, but at night, Peppa could swear its head had turned ever so slightly toward her. On the third night, Peppa heard a rustling sound. She woke up and saw that the box was open. A sheet of paper was sticking out. She got up and walked closer. On the paper was a photograph, their house, but the windows were black voids, and three faceless figures stood by the door, just shadows. On the fourth day, one of Peppa's drawings disappeared from the wall. Then George's dinosaur toy was gone. They searched everywhere. There was no trace, and George whispered, "The box took it." The house began to change. Lights flickered. Mirrors grew cloudy. Shadows lingered in the hallways where there had been none during the day. Peppa tried to tell Daddy. He laughed. "What box, Peppa? We don't have a box." But there was fear in his eyes. On the fifth night, the box was standing right next to Peppa's bed. Inside was a doorknob, exactly like the one on their front door, only dirty and cold. Peppa ran to the hallway. The door was really broken. It could no longer be closed, and beyond the threshold stood the night, and the wind carried with it the sound of soft dragging footsteps. The sixth day, Peppa looked into the box. Inside was a drawing, one she hadn't made. It showed her, but the arms were too long, the head tilted at a strange angle, and the eyes, they stared directly at her. Underneath the drawing, scratched into the paper, were the words, "You're almost ready." That night, Peppa did not sleep. She sat and stared at the box. From inside, there came a light tapping, as if fingers were drumming against the inside walls. Then a rustle, then breathing. She shut her eyes tight. On the seventh night the box was empty. Only at the very bottom in the dust, scratched faintly, were the words, "Now you are part of me." Peppa looked around. The house was different, the hallways, long and empty, the windows, black and dead, and in the mirrors instead of her reflection stood the box, closer, each time even closer. And in the silence Peppa heard, "Just a little more, and you'll forget who you were."
Peppa Pig, the others. The evening sky was pale grey. The air was completely still. The pig family was having dinner in silence. The clinking of cutlery, the slow footsteps, the dripping of the tap. Everything sounded louder than usual. After dinner, Mummy Pig washed the dishes. Daddy Pig sat in his chair with the newspaper. George played with his dinosaur near the sofa. Peppa was putting together a puzzle on the floor. The evening felt like it was lasting slightly longer than it should. There was a knock at the door. Once, then again, no doorbell, no voices. Daddy Pig opened it. Standing on the doorstep were them, exact copies of the family, 1-to-1. Mummy, Daddy, Peppa, George, same clothes, same faces, same posture. Something was wrong. Their poses were too still, their expressions too flat. Eyes just slightly too dark, smiles frozen. They didn't speak. They simply stepped inside. No one stopped them. They spread out through the house. The second mummy stood at the sink. The second Daddy beside the chair. The second Peppa sat opposite the real one, moving a puzzle piece slowly back and forth, never placing it. The second George just stood there, glassy-eyed. At first, the real family just watched, as if it were all a mistake. But the copies didn't leave. They stayed, and acted as though they had always lived here. The next morning, it all happened again. 2 families under one roof. One breakfast, mirrored movements. But the copies were off, just slightly wrong, always half a second behind, as if mimicking learning. The second Daddy sat in the chair but never turned a page. The second Mummy washed already clean dishes. The second George held the dinosaur upside down and never blinked. The second Peppa stared directly at the real Peppa, unmoving, without emotion. Real Peppa tried to interact, but the other Peppa didn't speak. She only mirrored her like a reflection, a delayed, hollow one. By the 3rd day, the real family began to fade, literally. Their colors dulled, their movements slowed, their voices grew quiet. The mirrors showed only the new family. On the 4th day, the real George was gone. No one looked for him. The second George remained, walking silently through the house, smiling emptily. Peppa realized no one noticed them disappearing. Real Daddy and Mummy were pale, tired, fading like old photographs. The copies now moved with more energy, more clarity. They no longer imitated. They simply existed. On the 5th day, the real Mummy vanished. Only Peppa remained, still bright, still real. She tried to leave. The front door was there, but nothing was behind it. Only solid white light, no road, no sky, no sound. The other Peppa now slept in her bed, wore her clothes, held her toys. The dinosaur rested in the hands of the new George. One night, real Peppa woke to find the other Peppa watching her, from beneath the bed, still, unblinking. After that, there was silence. The new family lived in the house. They laughed, cooked, played. They looked normal, as if they had always been there. But in the cupboard beneath the stairs, behind old boxes and bags, if you look closely, you might see a pale pink shape, sitting quietly, knees to chest. No face, no eyes, no name. It doesn't move anymore. Peppa Pig, lost episode, the new one. One morning, Peppa woke up, and there was someone else in the room. He was sitting on the bed beside George, about their age. His skin was pale, almost gray. He didn't move or speak, but when Peppa stood up, he looked at her and smiled, as if he had been waiting. Everything else was ordinary: the bright morning light, the familiar bedroom, the smell of breakfast. Except this new child, unknown, uninvited, behaved as though he had always lived there. In the kitchen, 3 bowls were already set on the table. Mummy Pig served breakfast without a hint of confusion. Daddy Pig flipped through his newspaper. George laughed and ate his porridge. Everyone carried on as if nothing had changed. The new child ate with them. Throughout the day, Peppa watched. He helped set the table. He played with George. He sat with Daddy Pig. He drew pictures. His name was Ralphie. Everyone said it so casually, so naturally, as if he had always been part of the family. But Peppa didn't remember him. Not from yesterday, not from last week, not from ever. She checked the family photo albums. Ralphie was in all of them, standing beside George, holding hands, sitting on Daddy Pig's lap. Where Peppa used to be, now he was, as if she had been carefully cut out and replaced. On the second day, the bedroom changed. Peppa's bed was pushed into the corner. Her things began to vanish, clothes, toys, even her books. In their place were new objects, gray, unfamiliar, lifeless, no scent, no name, no memory. The family talked to each other, smiled, lived their lives, but none of them looked at Peppa. Sometimes their gaze passed near her, but never directly. She tried to make herself known, with movement, with noise, with presence, but was met only with silence, or worse, polite indifference. Only Ralphie looked directly at her, for long moments, without blinking. He never blinked, and his smile, always the same, whether he was eating, playing, or simply sitting still. He knew. By the third day, her name was never spoken. No one called her for meals. No one asked where she was. George laughed only with Ralphie. Mummy Pig stroked his head when he passed. Daddy Pig read bedtime stories to two children. On the fourth morning, Peppa's bed was gone. The room now had only two beds, George's and Ralphie's. Her belongings had disappeared completely. There were no traces. The only photo on the wall showed four figures: Ralphie, George, Mummy Pig, and Daddy Pig. The caption beneath it read, "Our family." The mirror reflected the empty room. Ralphie and George played on the floor. Peppa stood in the doorway, but her reflection wasn't there. The house looked the same, but inside it, another story had begun. One where Peppa had never existed. That night, she simply faded. No sound, no trace, no goodbye. The next morning, someone carefully closed her old sketchbook. On the last page was a drawing. Two children, a mother and a father. Four simple shapes. No names, no Peppa. Peppa Pig. Lost episode. The Growing Dinosaur. It all started on an ordinary morning. Peppa woke up and noticed George's plush dinosaur, Mr. Dino, standing right next to her bed. It was staring straight at her. George said maybe it had moved there on its own during the night. Peppa just snorted. He probably just played with it before bed and forgot. The next day, the dinosaur looked different. Its plastic eyes seemed shinier, almost wet. The teeth, sharper, and Peppa could have sworn it had grown a little taller. George said proudly that Mr. Dino was growing. He seemed proud. That night, Peppa woke up to a deep, dragging sound in the dark. Something heavy was moving inside their shared bedroom. She thought George was playing again, but when she turned, George was asleep, and Mr. Dino was gone from its usual spot. In the morning, the toy stood between their beds. Now it was nearly as tall as George. The stitching along its side had started to split. Something inside was shifting. From then on, George began to change. He stopped playing with Peppa. He stayed in their room, whispering to the dinosaur, feeding it real food. He said it talked to him. He said it would protect him from the ones who come at night. He wouldn't say who they were. Mummy Pig grew worried. That night, she quietly took Mr. Dino and hid it in the attic. But by dawn, the house was filled with strange noises, scratching, thudding, slow, heavy footsteps. The next morning, the attic door was torn off its hinges. Mr. Dino was back between the children's beds, but now it nearly touched the ceiling. Its eyes were no longer plastic. They moved. Peppa tried to tell her parents the toy was alive, that it was watching them, but no one believed her. George clung to the dinosaur and whispered, "He's real now. He'll never leave me." That night, Peppa woke up to a cracking noise. At first, she thought it was just the wind. Then she heard George call her name. But the voice wasn't his. It was deeper, slower. The light in their room flickered, then silence. And with a slam, the door locked itself from the inside. When the parents finally opened the door the next morning, the beds were empty. No Peppa, no George, only long claw marks on the floor. The wallpaper was torn, and the dinosaur, far too big to be a toy anymore, was gone. On the floor lay a small blanket and a child's drawing. It showed a towering green dinosaur holding the hands of two small pigs, and in the corner of the room, a faint message had been scratched into the wall. "He's not a toy anymore. Now he's with us." The Two-Headed Nightmare. One quiet night, when the entire pig family was asleep, strange things began happening in the house. Peppa and George were awakened by an odd rustling sound. At first, they thought it was just the wind outside, but with every passing moment, the sound grew louder and closer. Peppa and George were scared and decided to go downstairs to find out what was going on. As they approached the staircase, they saw dim light coming from the kitchen. They quietly crept toward the door and peeked inside. What they saw made them freeze in terror. Mama and Papa Pig were standing in the middle of the kitchen, but their bodies were distorted. Instead of two separate figures, they had fused into one giant form with two heads on a single body. One face was Mama Pig's, the other was Papa Pig's. Their faces were twisted with grotesque smiles, and their eyes were filled with emptiness. They started moving, their skin and bones creaking. Peppa and George were terrified, but they couldn't look away. Suddenly, one of the heads turned toward them and spoke in an eerie voice. "You shouldn't have seen this." Their voices merged into one, creating a strange, hoarse whisper that penetrated deep into their souls. The creature began to move toward the children, its movements jerky, as if it couldn't control its own body. The shadows on the walls began to distort, as if the shadows themselves were part of this monster. Peppa and George felt their hearts pounding with fear, and cold sweat covered their bodies. They tried to run, but the two-headed mutant was already too close. It rushed toward them with lightning speed despite its bulky form, and for a moment Peppa and George were trapped in its grasp. With every passing second, they felt their strength leaving them, as if they were losing the very essence of their existence. Just as they were about to lose consciousness, the monstrous figure stopped. Instead of consuming them, it turned and began to disappear into the shadows. All that remained of their parents were the haunting echoes of their voices, now resonating in every corner of the house. Peppa and George realized that they were no longer children, but mere victims of this nightmare. The next morning, when they woke up, the house was quiet again. Mama and Papa Pig had vanished. Everything around them was the same as before, but there was now a strange, oppressive silence in the air, and Peppa and George could no longer feel the warmth and safety of home. But they knew the nightmare had not ended. It would always follow them like a shadow, for no one can escape the dark forces hidden within their own parents.